Parashat Pekudei and Parashat Chodesh is a very, very appropriate time to talk about Rosh Chodesh Nissan. In Parashat Pekudei, it says, "Bayom HaChodesh HaRishon B'Echad HaChodesh Takim Et HaMishkan Al Moed." So Rosh Chodesh Nissan was also the day in which the structure of the Mishkan was put up, as well as, of course, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim, regarding Rosh Chodesh in terms of preparation for Yetziat Mitzrayim, and in general, the entire idea of Am Yisrael being Mekadesh Esazmanim, Mekadesh Chadashim, and thereby also being Mekadesh the Moadim. Regarding what exactly happened on Rosh Chodesh Nisan of the second year, so there's machlokas among the Mefarshim. The Ibn Ezra says, according to Pshuto Shamikra, the day that they put up the Mishkan on Rosh Chodesh was the first day of the Miluim. In other words, afterwards you had 7 days of Miluim, and afterwards you had Yom HaShmini. Yom HaShmini, when the fire came down from the heavens, and then Nadav and Avihu were killed. That was on the 8th day of Nisan. But Rosh Chodesh Nisan was the first day of the Miluim, and he claims that that's Pshuto Shel Mikra. However, the dominant position in Chazal, and most of the Mefarshim, is that Rosh Chodesh Nisan was the 8th day. In other words, actually the Miluim started on Chav Gimel Nisan. When the structure was actually put up, it was on Chav Gimel of Adar, and Rosh Chodesh was the 8th day. When the fire came down from the heavens, when Nadav and Avihu were killed, all that was on Yom HaShmini, on the 8th day, and that was what happened on Rosh Chodesh. So, for instance, in the Torah's Kohanim, it says, "We Pesach Ol Moed Lo Tetzu Shivat Yamim." It was for the 7 days of the Miluim, you don't leave the structure of the Mishkan. Mikan Amru, Be'esim v'shalosh ba'Adar Karvu HaMiluim. And it was on the 23rd of Adar that they started bringing the Karban Miluim. And if you count 7 days from there, so the 8th day was on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, was on the 31st of Adar, which is already Rosh Chodesh. And each one of those 7 days, Moshe Rabbeinu would, in the morning, put up the Mishkan, and at night he would take down the Mishkan. So when it says in our pasuk, "Vayom HaChodesh HaRishon Takim Et HaMishkan," it's talking about in a permanent way in which it wouldn't be taken down every night. But during the Shivas Mei Miluim, it was put up. They did whatever they had to do during the day, and then they took it down. The next day they put it up, and they took it down. But Yom HaShmini was the day in which it was put up and not taken down at night. So that's what the Torah's Kohanim says. Kol Shivai Mei Miluim Haya Moshe Ma'amir Et HaMishkan Kol Boker Uboker Makiv Komerotav Alav Umefarko. They would bring the sacrifices and then they would take it down. B'Shmini Ha'amid Ovlo Perko. So that was the day B'Yom Rishon Takim Et HaMishkan in a permanent way, and Rashi follows the dominant position in Chazal. There are a number of different parshios which are tangential to this basic question. For instance, on Yom HaShmini, after Nadav and Avihu are killed, so the pasuk says, "V'tzi'ir chatat darosh darash Moshe v'nei saraf." You know, they were told that they should eat the karbanos or the kudshim of, that were sacrificed on Yom HaShmini, despite the fact that they were avelim, and usually an oni does not eat karbanos, but for some reason the seir was burnt and not eaten. So Moshe Rabbeinu questioned them, "Why didn't you eat the seir?" So what? Why didn't you eat the seir? So Rashi comments, "Seir chatat, seir musfei Rosh Chodesh." It's not talking about the seir that they brought on Yom HaShmini, which was a seir chatat, which was a special korban for that day, but rather, since it was also Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the seir that they're referring to is the seir of Rosh Chodesh. Ushlosh sirei chatat karvu bo bayom. There were 3 different sirei chatat. One, seir nachshon, because the first day from Yom HaShmini on was also the first day that the Nisim brought the karbanos. For the next 12 days, each day the Nisim brought the karbanos. So Yom HaShmini was the day of the korban of Nachshon, the Nasi of Yehuda. He brought a seir lechatas. Aside from that, there was also seir Rosh Chodesh, because it was Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And also there was the special seir of Yom HaShmini. Umikula no nisraf elazeh. And Rashi basically explains that the reason that they burnt it and didn't eat it is because if there was a horah shah, that they're supposed to eat a seir even though they're onanim and they don't usually eat kachim, maybe that's only for the special korbanos of that day. But the seir Rosh Chodesh, which is kachei daros, that should go back to the standard din that an onen doesn't eat the korban. So that's the way Chazal deal with the seir that wasn't eaten. And it's all based on the fact that they view Yom HaShmini as being Rosh Chodesh Nissan. Therefore, there was a seir Rosh Chodesh. There's another question, another parsha that's tangential to this machlokas, and that's the question of when it comes to Pesach Sheni. So it says, "Vayu anashim shayu tmeim nefesh adam," and they couldn't bring the korban in Pesach Rishon, and therefore they turned to Moshe Rabbeinu, who turned to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, "Bring Pesach Sheni." So who were these people that were tmeim? Who were they? So the Gemara brings the machlokas, and some say, "Mi hayu no say Aaron shel Yosef hayu divrei Rabbi Yossi." It was Rabbi Yossi Aglili. It was the people that were carrying the Aaron of Yosef. They took the Aaron of Yosef from Mitzrayim, so they were tamei, and therefore they couldn't bring the korban on Pesach Rishon. They brought it Pesach Sheni. Rabbi Akiva Omer Mishal v'Tzafan hayu. Mishal v'Tzafan were the ones who took Nadav Avihu out of the Mishkan, so they became tamei. Shayu oskim b'Nadav Avihu. Rabbi Yitzchak Omer im nosei Aaron shel Yosef hayu kfar yichol mitayr, because they were encamped by Sinai for months, so they didn't have to carry the bones of Yosef, and they could have already become tar. Im yishal v'Tzafan hayu, if it was the ones that took Nadav Avihu out of the Mishkan, hayu yichol mitayr, they had enough time to become tar. Ela osku meis mitzvah hayu shechal shvi shlem lios be'erev Pesach. It was meis mitzvah, and the seventh day came out on erev Pesach, and therefore they couldn't bring the korban Pesach. Okay, so the question is, why is it so clear that Mishal v'Tzafan couldn't become tar? So Rashi explains, because when was Nadav and Avihu killed? On the first day of Nissan, Rosh Chodesh. According to that day, on Rosh Chodesh. So, and they already had the paradum on the second day, so they had enough time. You need 7 days in order to become tar. There was plenty of time to become tar. The question, of course, is, what does Rabbi Akiva think? Does Rabbi Akiva think they couldn't become tar, they just didn't, and therefore they were tamei? Or does Rabbi Akiva think they couldn't become tar? Why couldn't they become tar? So Tosfos brings a girsa in the Gemara in Yevamos. Gemara in Psachim. Rav Savar Lakrabi. Rabbi Akiva, Da'ama Mishal v'Tzafan hayu shechal shvi shlam liyot be'erev Pesach. In other words, according to Rabbi Akiva, the seventh day came on Erev Pesach. In other words, if you say the seventh day was on Erev Pesach, it must be that Yom HaShmini was on the 8th day, not on the first day, the day of Rosh Chodesh. In other words, there is the position of Rabbi Akiva that holds that the Rosh Chodesh was the first day of Hakaras HaMishkan, the first day of Shiva Simei Miluim, and therefore Mishal v'Tzafan couldn't become tahor. They didn't have the 7 days needed in order to become tahor before Erev Pesach. So that's a gersa that Tosfos brings in the Gemara in Pesachim, but he rejects that gersa. He says, "Miu oto gersa lesa el Rabbi Yitzchak garas hasam." It's Rabbi Yitzchak, not Rabbi Akiva, and according to Rabbi Yitzchak, of course, the Shvi was on Erev Pesach, as opposed to Rabbi Akiva. Anyway, the Ibn Ezra defends his position, and he says, if we're talking about the seir, there's a seir that's mentioned explicitly in the parasha, the seir of the Yom HaShmini. And if you're talking about the people that were tamei, well, Rabbi Akiva says that it was that they couldn't become tar. They couldn't become tar because they didn't have the 7 days between Yom HaShmini. So therefore, he says it certainly is in Pshuto Shamikra, he claims that the Yom HaShmini was not on the first day on Rosh Chodesh, but rather on the 8th day. But as I said, the dominant position was that it was on the 8th day, and apparently the reason that Chazal put so much importance to the 8th day is because they looked at Rosh Chodesh Nissan as a day that had meta-historical importance. And there's a Gemara in Shabbos on that Pei Zayin Amud Beis that says, "Vayihi b'chodesh harishon b'shah shenit b'echad hachodesh hukama mishkan," our pasuk, and it says, "Tana oto yom natal eser atarot." That day, Rosh Chodesh took 10 crowns. Rishon the Masa Brachis, Rishon the Nesiim. When it was the day in which the Nachshon ben Anav started bringing his carbon. Right? Rishon the Kahuna. It was the first day that the Kohanim actually did avoda in the Mikdash. The Kohanim and Aaron, they actually did avoda, because during the 70 days of Miluim, it was Moshe that did the avoda. So in other words, Yom HaShmini is Rosh Chodesh. Rishon Yiridas HaEsh. It's the day in which the Eish came down Mishamayim. That's on Yom HaShmini. Rishon L'Shkon Shechina. It was the day in which the Shechina appeared to Am Yisrael. And Rishon L'Chadashim, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chadashim. It's the beginning of the year. It's the first month. So, there are a number of that I didn't mention, but the ones that are critical. In other words, this day has meta-historical importance. So what was the day that was important? The day that was more critical was Yom HaShmini, when the Eish came down Mishamayim, when they started doing Avodah in the Mishkan, the Kohanim themselves. And that was the day that was more critical. And therefore, Chazal see Rosh Chodesh as being the critical date, connecting HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chadashim together with the day in which the Mishkan was put up in a permanent way. The Eish came down Mishamayim, and Nachshon ben Anav brought his carbon. And based on this view of Rosh Chodesh Nissan of the second year being such a critical, important day in a meta-historical, from medical perspective, it would explain something else which is very, very interesting. This day appears in 3 different Chumashim. First of all, it appears in Parashat Pekudei, then in Parashat Shmos. This was the day in Shehu Kam HaMishkan, and according to Chazal, that was Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Second of all, the day appears on Yom HaShmini in Vayikra, without any mention. There's a whole separate parsha of Yom HaShmini which appears in Vayikra, and then it appears again in Bamidbar when it talks about the Karbanos HaNesiyim. So it appears in our parsha, Vayi b'chodesh harishon hu kam HaMishkan, Vayakem Moshe et HaMishkan, Vayitein et Adonav, Vayisam et Krashav. He put up the entire structure. He finished doing all the malacha. Vayichas ha'anan es ha'oel mo'edu chvoshem maleh et HaMishkan. When it said Rishon Hashras HaShechina, it's referring to the end of Shmos. And then Vayi b'yom HaShmini kara Moshe v'Aaron in Vayikra. Vayomer kach lecha ega b'mekal lechatad va'ela olah tumim v'akrev lifnei Hashem. Vayom Moshe el Aaron krav mizbeach v'aseh. And that's all the story that appears in Vayikra with Aaron and then Nadav Avihu being killed. And that's a separate, parsha that deals with the same day. And then there's a third parsha, and that's in Bamidbar, when it says Vayi b'yom kolot mashel hakim et hamishkan, which is at the end of the process of Shemitz Mei Milum, which is on the 8th day. Rashi says, Lo nemar b'yom hikim, v'lama shekol Shemitz Mei Milum hayam Moshe ma'amidom u'farko. But what's Yom Klos Hashem? Yom HaShmini. So then, vayimshach oto, vaykadesh oto, they anointed the Mishkan, they sanctified the Mishkan, vayakriv v'nasim et chanukat HaMizbeach b'yom mashach oto. Vayom Hashem Moshe nasi achad hayom. They all brought their kabbalos, and the Moshe Rabbeinu said, each day a different nasi will bring his korban. So it was the first day of Nachshon, Rosh Chodesh. So it's mentioned in 3 different parshos. If you read the parsha in Bamidbar, you would have no sense at all that Nadav Avihu died on that day. If you read the parsha in Shmos, you would have no sense that Nadav Avihu died on that day, or that the Eish came down Mishamayim. And you have 3 separate parshos that deal with the Yom HaShmini. And apparently, we're talking about 3 different aspects. We're talking about, first of all, the parsha of in Shmos focuses on Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu and the Shechina in the Mikdash, Vayichas Hanan v'lo yochol Moshe, because of the Shechina that was in the Mishkan. It focuses on Moshe. In Vayikra, the parsha in Vayikra and Shmini focuses on Aaron. Aaron krav l'mizbeach v'aseh, you do the karbanos. It's also a kapara for Chet HaEgel, a tikkun for Chet HaEgel, which Aaron was involved in. And therefore they're waiting for the Eish to come down Mishamayim, a sign that HaKadosh Baruch Hu actually forgave them. And Vayom HaShmini focuses on Aaron, and as opposed to Aaron, Nadav Avihu. So there it's a focus on the kahuna and specifically on Aaron, while in Bamidbar it focuses on Am Yisrael. It focuses on the Sim, which are representative of Am Yisrael. So Yom HaShmini is separated because that day in which they put up the Mishkan, it focuses on Moshe Rabbeinu and Kvod Hashem and the Shechina. That's in Shmos. It focuses on Aaron and the Kohanim and Tikkun of the Chet HaEgel, and that appears in Vayikra. And it focuses on the fact that here all of a sudden we have a Mishkan for all of Am Yisrael, V'asuli Mikdash V'Shachanti B'toch B'nei Yisrael.